Hello and welcome to the Leesburg Library Show. My name is Dusty Matthews and I'm a librarian in the Adult Services Department. With me today is Shannon Walker, who is from the Orlando VA, and she's here to talk about suicide prevention and an education program called Operation Save that the VA runs, and they come to places like libraries and other facilities so that they can tell people about the warning signs and the risks of suicide among veterans and other people as well. Shannon, welcome and thank you so much for being here today.
Yes, ma'am, my pleasure.
Tell us why suicide prevention is always a timely subject.
Suicide prevention is always a timely subject for the simple reason that suicide is the second most common reason for death in the United States. So with it being such a common reason for death, it's something that we could prevent, and we want to make sure that everyone is aware about suicide, the risk factors, the signs and symptoms, and what we could do to possibly prevent suicide.
Okay. Tell us a little about your role at the VA, about your training and the kind of educational programs you present.
Okay. Well, my background is I'm an Air Force veteran. I served for 6 years. I was commissioned from Valdosta State University after receiving a bachelor's in exercise science. And then after separating from the Air Force, I went on to get a bachelor's in nursing, and I worked at the Central Alabama Veterans Healthcare System, where I did psychiatric nursing and a program called HUD-VASH. And here at the Orlando VA, I am a suicide prevention case manager.
Great, thank you. So you've had a lot of training in this.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Can you give us some numbers so that we can kind of get an idea of the scope of situation, of the situation about suicide attempts and completed suicides?
Yes, ma'am. About 37,000 deaths per year are due to suicide, which, if you think about it in relation to homicides, about 17,000 deaths per year are due to homicide. So you're looking at almost double the rate of suicides versus that of homicide. And then when you're talking about specifically veterans make up about 20% of the deaths by suicide in the United States overall.
So what kind of number is that per month?
Well, 950 suicide attempts per month is from veterans, and then about 22 actual completed suicides are by veterans every day.
Wow. And since you have that specific number, does that mean that those are veterans who are in some kind of program, people who are already seeking help?
Yes, ma'am. All the numbers that I'm giving you are about people that are actually enrolled for VA care. So not all veterans actually receive their medical care from the VA. So we really don't know if that number could actually be higher, because a lot of veterans don't come for care, so we don't know about their attempts or completions thereafter.
Okay. Okay. How long has the VA been running Operation Save? And tell us a little bit more about it, because Operation Save is the educational component, but then it's made up of other things, right?
So yes, ma'am. So in Operation Save, which is an education outreach program where we travel to various locations, including we're trying to reach students, staff members, employees, firefighters, policemen, everybody, the community overall. And the goal of the program is to highlight SAVE, which is an acronym, and it talks about the signs of suicide, asking the right question, validating the person's experience, and expediting them getting help. So the purpose of that outreach is to get everyone aware of SAVE and how you can help prevent a suicide. In that presentation, we highlight the Veterans Crisis Line, which is a line that is available to everyone, but when you press 1, it's specifically for veterans. So the Veterans Crisis Line has been around since 2007. And then there's different caveats that break out. So in 2009, they started with chatting, and then in 2011, they started with text messaging. So they have different capabilities that have grown with time. But the line, they have a lot of different products, and the number is 1-800-273-8255. And when you call that number, it'll ask you if you're a veteran, and this question pertains to the person that's calling. It could be a family member, it could be a friend, but if the call is related to a veteran, you would press 1. And that's what turns it into a Veterans Crisis Line versus just a National Suicide Prevention Hotline.
Okay. Okay, so there is a relationship between the Veterans Crisis Line and the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline.
Yes, ma'am.
So who staffs the telephones for those lifelines?
So for the Veterans Crisis Line, they're VA staff members. It's a call center in Canandaigua, New York, staffed by licensed mental health professionals. The hotline for both the Veterans Crisis Line and the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, they're manned 24/7, 365 days a year, and they're just qualified mental health professionals awaiting the person's call. One thing about the Veterans Crisis Line, we are trying to prevent suicide amongst anyone, veterans specifically, but the line is also addressing whatever that person deems as a crisis. So sometimes the person might not actually be suicidal. They may have some other needs that's causing a crisis for them at that time. The people on the line actually address those issues as well.
Okay, so a call to the Lifeline can also put a veteran in touch with local agencies?
Resources, yes ma'am. Perhaps you have a young lady whose father is ill and he hasn't been connected with the VA as a resource. She could simply call this line on behalf of her father, and the person that answers the phone would route her to her appropriate facility. So if she called from Orlando, Florida, the call would go to Canandaigua, New York, and the person that she speaks to would route that call back to the staff here at the Orlando VA, and we would reach out to her and provide her with the resources that she needs.
Okay, so a call to the national number or the 800 number still can put someone in touch with local resources.
Yes, ma'am.
That's great. I was looking on the website that you had recommended that's called veteranscrisisline.net. And it's a very valuable site with information, contact numbers for agencies and help for veterans, the locations of veterans clinics and VA centers, and it also has a chat window. Why use texting and online chatting? Are those kind of impersonal?
They can be impersonal, and the age range for veterans can be anywhere from 18 to 99. It's a large group of people, and different age groups are comfortable communicating in different ways, and different situations may cause for a different comfort level in your ability to communicate. So let's say the only way that I'm able to reach out is via the computer, and I'm 21 years old, and I really would like to cry out for help. I may not have access to a telephone. Chatting might be the only way that I can communicate with you. Or perhaps I'm in a situation where confidentiality might be an issue if I were to actually try to have an out loud verbal conversation with you. So I'd rather text you and chat with you. Some people just don't like to talk, actually talk. They communicate better through writing. So it's just an alternative means to try to reach those age groups or people who are comfortable communicating in different ways for whatever reason.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Veteranscrisisline.net also links to something called Make the Connection. What can you tell us about that?
Okay, Make the Connection is something that the VA has put out, and what it is it's a program where you could log on, and let's say you were a 30-year-old African American female who was suffering from PTSD, and you wanted to know what's all this hoopla about the VA and what can the VA do for you. Or perhaps you're not really interested in seeking care. You might have heard about Make the Connection. You could go log on, and it would actually ask you for your age, what your ethnic group is, and what war you served in, or what time frame you served in. So 30-year-old African American female and OEF veteran. I can click these things, and then an African American female in the age group of maybe 25 to 35 will come up, and she will explain to me how she has PTSD and what the VA has done to assist her, and how she's grown and changed through her mental health care at the VA, versus me maybe having to speak to a 70-year-old white male from the Vietnam era who I might not be able to relate to when it comes to PTSD. So it's making the connection between a veteran and another veteran on a screen, perhaps drawing you in for whatever care it may be.
Okay, so the goal is to get a peer,
Exactly.
a peer veteran to
Yep,
talk to you.
exactly, and maybe
Okay.
help you make the connection as to why it is good for you to come into the VA and receive mental health care for something that you might not have even been diagnosed with. Maybe I could describe some symptoms to you that you didn't know you had, but because you can relate to the person on the screen, you're more open.
Okay. Now, is that available, the same hours, is that available?
It's actually a website, and so yes, ma'am, it's available 24/7, and it's just a matter of accessing the website and logging on. And
Okay.
again, this is something that even if the person themselves, the veteran themselves, isn't open to care, perhaps a family member could access this site and have that person view it just to see, hey, look at this, Dad, look at this guy. He was over there too, you know, just to kind of draw them in. So a lot of people are apprehensive about seeking care.
So this is still, but it's still confidential, and
Oh,
it's
yes, ma'am.
still private. And,
Oh yes, ma'am. Make the connection is actually, it's not requiring the veteran to share any information other than, you know, what are you interested in? So I could be a 30-year-old African American female and click different parameters just to see the differences and see different people come up, and just to hear what different signs and symptoms another ethnic group might bring up.
Okay. Are there differences between the ethnic groups and the number of attempts?
Yes, ma'am. Unfortunately, white males are at the highest risk, and they have the highest success rate in completing suicides, whereas Asian and Pacific Islanders have the lowest suicidal rate. So veterans, of course, are at the highest risk for suicide, and then we're looking at white males as, in general, in the whole United States population, as being having the highest rate of suicide. So there is a disparity amongst the ethnic groups, and then breaking it down even further, there's a disparity between genders as far as males versus females. Women tend to attempt suicide 3 times more than men do, but men are 4 times more likely than women to be successful. And so basically what I just said was, a woman will try, and she will do it in less lethal means, such as perhaps cutting her wrist or taking pills, which a lot of times is seen as a cry for help, or it's possible to save her and she's not successful at her suicide attempt, versus men doing more lethal things such as using weapons or ropes and hanging, and they're more successful, they're more lethal, and their methods are quicker. And so that's why I say they're more successful at completions.
Okay, so the VA takes all of this into consideration when they are encouraging people to get help. That
Yes, ma'am.
there are people available that can help them and relate to them by their gender,
Yes, ma'am.
or by their ethnicity,
Exactly.
or by their age, or by the
Exactly.
conflict that they've served in.
Yes, ma'am.
So they really want to reach out to everybody, and
Yes,
it's available to everybody.
Yes, ma'am.
Wow. If someone is concerned about a veteran and maybe knows that that they're not seeking available help, what's the first call to make, or what's the first thing to do?
The first suggestion that I would suggest for someone is to call the Veterans Crisis Line. That's the easiest, quickest thing that's available. The Veterans Crisis Line puts out a lot of promotional materials, so it's easy to keep up with that number. The number's available on pill bottles, wristbands. It's inundated everywhere, but they could log on. But that number is available 24/7. And again, if the person calls, it gets routed to Canandaigua, New York, but the call could be in relation to anything. That would be the first stop. And then secondly, I would suggest that that person just bring that member to their local VA for assistance.
Okay. Could it be to any VA facility?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
So,
Because I understand that there are clinics and then there are centers.
yes, ma'am.
Okay.
But a veteran would not be turned away from any facility, so it doesn't matter if it's a clinic versus a medical center versus a hospital.
Okay.
But again, the reason I suggest calling the Veterans Crisis Line is, instead of that person having to go out and look for those resources, somebody will call them and tell them exactly where they need to go.
Okay.
So for instance, I would tell you to report to 520 Raymond Street, the green team, the fourth floor, and speak to this person versus you just going and trying to navigate the system yourself. So if you call the line, that'll give somebody from your local VA an opportunity to reach out to you.
Got it. Okay. All right. Do you think the stigma of suicide prevents us from seeking help or even offering help when we recognize a problem or even just a potential problem?
Yes, ma'am. And even more so than just the stigma of suicide, the stigma of mental health in general, it prevents people from wanting to talk about it. Sometimes the interest is lower when you talk about something such as suicide, just because it can be an uncomfortable subject for a lot of people. More so than any reason, it's just because we don't understand it. There's a lot of myths surrounding suicide, a lot of different factors to include people's religions, opinions that kind of get in the way of the real meat. And the key is that everyone understand that suicide is a preventable issue, that the more we talk about it, the more you learn about it, the more you're able to recognize the signs and symptoms. It's not anything that we need to be afraid of. If somebody were to come up to you and talk to you about cancer, you wouldn't be nervous or afraid. You'd want to find out what can I do to see these signs in myself? What do I need to do to prevent getting cancer? Suicide shouldn't be viewed any differently.
So still, though, it's hard to know what to say to someone who seems hopeless. What's a helpful thing to say?
One of the things that I like to point out to people to say to someone who's feeling hopeless is to remind them that you're there. That a lot of times people in hopeless situations, people think that you should say everything's going to be okay, it's going to be all right, but you don't want to lie to a person. And the truth of the matter is, it might be a while before everything's okay or everything's all right. So you don't want to candy coat or sugar coat things or even lie just to try to get through that moment, but focus on what you are able to control and what you do know is true. And what you do know to be true is that you're there, or that their family members care for them and love them. And just remind them of things that could kind of hone them back in, because when you're hopeless, you're irrational. You can't see past whatever it is that is bothering you. So a lot of times I just like to tell people that you are enough. It's nerve-wracking to be with somebody and you feel like you can't say the right things, and what do I say, what do I do? But just let them know that you're here. Let them know that you're there.
What's an example of something not to say? What's something not helpful?
Okay, so I was mentioning, like, you wouldn't want to say everything's going to be okay, everything's going to be all right. Or another thing is not to diminish whatever it is that perhaps that person could be confiding in you about. So if I'm telling you that my boyfriend just broke up with me and it's obviously causing me to be distraught, this wouldn't be the time for you to say, oh, it'll be okay. There's other fish in the sea. It's just being able to identify the difference between a casual conversation and a cry for help.
Now, Shannon, you work for the VA, but is this information that you're sharing only applicable to veterans, and the resources that you've discussed? How does that? How can anyone use that? Okay,
so wherever I've said veteran previously, you could just remove that word and insert person. The Veterans Crisis Line, again, if you press 1, it is specifically for veterans. But if you don't press 1, the same materials and informations are available to you. They're just not going to be routed through the local VA. So there's a lot of material and information that's available. When you call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, there are local mental health professionals and social workers that are readily available to provide the community resources that are available for civilian personnel.
Okay, great. I was reading through the frequently asked questions on veteranscrisisline.net, and a statement jumped out at me, and it said, "Crisis feels different for everybody and can stem from a wide range of situations." It mentions aging, stress, relationship problems, financial problems, legal issues, or lingering effects stemming from their military service which were never addressed. And this seems really important to keep in mind, that the causes of a crisis aren't always obvious, and they may not always be responding to a single event.
Exactly.
What can you...
Hearing you say that makes me think about Operation SAVE, the acronym, again, focusing in on the V. So the S was signs of suicide. The A was asking the most important question, which is, are you thinking of killing yourself? The V is validating that person's experience, and the E is expediting them getting help. So going back to what you said about how crisis feels different to everyone, when you're there with a person, you want to validate whatever it is that they're going through. Like I had mentioned earlier, this is not the time to pass judgment or appear closed off in a conversation. Whatever that person is dealing at a crisis, it's a valid scenario at that time. And so whether or not your religion agrees with whatever it is this person is going through, or perhaps your upbringing makes you feel as though whatever it is that they're dealing with is not that big of a deal. Crisis is different to everyone, and like you said, it could be that it wasn't a single event. It could be something that has grown over time. Perhaps they could be dealing with issues with honor, where they were once doing something honorable, and now as they've aged, they don't feel like whatever they're doing is bringing any honor to their life. That's not something that you're going to see happen overnight. It's going to happen over time, and potentially it could catapult into a suicidal thought, or perhaps even attempt. So what you said was paramount, and I think that people should remember to validate a person and not pass judgment.
Okay. How can a loved one or a friend support someone who is receiving treatment? If you have a loved one, someone you're concerned about, and they have begun to get help, what's the best way to support them through that?
One good way is, if it's possible, go with them. If they have medical appointments and they're open to you attending those appointments with them, go with them, just so that they can see that you agree in what they're doing being important. Like you agree with the fact that them going to their medical appointments is important. With older people, a lot of times we see they're not working anymore, so the spouses are able to attend appointments with the other people, but sometimes that's not always feasible. But just asking a person, how did your appointment go today, or when is your next appointment, showing some type of interest in something that's very key in their life. Another thing that you could do to be supportive of somebody is making sure that they have the means to get to wherever it is they're going. So a lot of times people would be willing to give someone $5 to go to a basketball game, but how about if you give somebody $5 to catch a bus to go to a doctor's appointment? So just the little things to show them that you're interested and that you recognize that their care is important.
So it is good to acknowledge that and congratulate them.
Exactly.
Celebrate the fact that they're getting help.
Exactly.
Great. As we close today, I'd like to thank Shannon Walker for being here with us today, and for sharing. I'd like to thank you for sharing your time and your wisdom with us, and also thank you for your service.
Yes, ma'am.
Shannon's going to return to the Leesburg Library on Tuesday, January 6th at 11 a.m. for an informative presentation. She'll have more information with us, along with resources and promotional items for attendees to take home with them. If you want more information about Shannon's upcoming presentation, or about any of the other events at the Leesburg Library, check out our website at www.leesburgflorida.gov/library. Thank you for joining us today.